We are continuing in our journey with Joshua, still conquering the land of Canaan. In fact, this chapter is absolutely maybe the most kinetic chapter in the book of Joshua, where it's really the war. The war is on. Um, just give me one second. I'm sorry. Please forgive the delay. Guys, apologize one second. Okay. Okay. So here we are in chapter 10. There are chapters in the Tanakh that seem to be about one thing until we look more closely, and then we discover that something much larger is happening. And Yoshua chapter 10 looks like a classic war story. Five kings attack the city of Givon, where the Gibeonites come from. Yehoshua marches through the night to rescue that town. Hashem throws the enemy into confusion. Huge stones fall from heaven. The sun stands still. Five kings hide in a cave and they're captured. And then Yoshua sweeps through the cities of southern Canaan. We'll take a look at the map later on in the shiur. It's really one of the most dramatic and, like I said, kinetic chapters in Sefer Yoshua. If you like action, this is your chapter. But it's also one of the most difficult chapters because by the end of the chapter, we're going to read again and again that entire Canaanite cities were destroyed and their populations were wiped out. It's brutal, brutal chapter. And the Torah itself, going back to Deuteronomy chapter 20, verse 16, already commanded, Lo techayeh kol neshama, that when the B'nai Israel would enter the land and would engage in these military campaigns, says the verse, you shall not allow any soul to live. Now, we're not going to pretend that verse is not there. And we're not going to soften it into something that it does not say. We have to deal with it. We're not going to wait until the last 5 minutes of the shiur and then like really quickly try to explain this away. Instead, we are going to ask what the Torah itself tells us that this war means. Is it simply one ancient people conquering another? Is this Israel taking territory because it's strong enough to take it? Or are we watching something that began centuries before Yehoshua was born? The moment when a divine judgment, delayed for many generations, finally enters history. Now, before we answer that question, let's first see the chapter as a whole. Yoshua chapter 10 is one continuous Masoretic section. We've already talked about this a few times, but I'll mention again that the Jewish traditional way of looking at Tanakh is according to its original editorial divisions, which were set up by the Baalei Mesorah, so rabbis who understanding what the tradition was in terms of where sections break and how they continue and what constitutes a full thematic section of the Tanakh, give us two marks. They give us the Samech and the Peh, right? We have the two letters which indicate whether we are entering a new section, um, or if it's a subsection of a larger topic. This chapter is one section. There's no internal ptucha or stuma dividing the chapter into separate units. So that alone is worth noticing because the chapter contains several very different scenes. But the Masorah, the tradition, asks us to read them as one unfolding story. I've mentioned before that we run into all sorts of problems reading the Tanakh according to chapter and verse, the way the Archbishop of Canterbury set that up, because a lot of themes are broken, and very often the thing is organized around Christological ideas. In other words, we're not going to get into that now. Okay. Let me just bring up a map quickly of what can be referred to as the Southern Campaign. Okay. Just, Angelique, if you can let me share the map.
Thank you, permission to.
Okay. Let's see if this works. Oh boy. Well, it's part of a web page. Let's see what we can do here. Okay. You see it? So again, if you look to the upper right corner, you see Gilgal. That's the first encampment. That's like the main base of operations for Israel, for Israel. You can see also just to the north of the red line, you see the city of Ai. Jericho was right next to Gilgal. That's the first battle. Then there were two battles at Ai. Then they went up north to Shem to pronounce the blessings and the curses on Mount Gerizim and Mount Ebal. And then they are met by these Gibeonites, and they come to the center here. We're still like sort of at that central mountainous ridge of what will become the land of Israel. And they discover that the Gibeonites are from this city here, right in the middle, like sort of by the top. It says Gibeon. In Hebrew, it's Givon. And they therefore understand that they have been deceived by these people. You can't really blame them. They wanted protection from what they saw was complete destruction. And therefore, they were made into wood choppers and water carriers, essentially manual laborers for B'nai Israel, in exchange for protection. So we will see in this chapter that 5 Canaanite kings will attack the city of Givon because they made peace with Israel. And the people of Givon, the same people who deceived Yehoshua and the Israelites into um, into thinking that this was a people that had come from very far away in order to convert, who needed their help. What do? They actually go to Givon and they defend the city because they honor the covenant that they made with these people, even though it was made under false pretenses. Then the campaign takes us to Beit Horon, which is to the left of that, and then as the red line goes down towards the southwestern corner, you can see the cities of Azekah and Lachish and Makeda, Eglon, Devere, Hebron. This is what is known as the Southern Campaign, and this is what is going to be described in the chapter. Okay. Okay, so verses 1 through 5, the five kings move against the city of Gibeon, led by Adoni-Tzedek, who is the king of Jerusalem. He hears that the city of Ai has fallen to the Bnei Israel, but he hears something else as well, something that really gets under his skin, which is that Gibeon, the Gibeonites, have made peace with Israel. And Gibeon is not a weak little village. In fact, the text says in chapter 10, verse 2, it says, Ki ir gidolah Gibeon ka'achat arei hamamlacha. Gibeon was a great city, like one of the royal cities. And the verse ends off by telling us, V'chol ansheha giborim. All of its men were mighty men, fighting men. And this was the city that made a peace treaty that essentially had in exchange for protection. Now that angered Adoni-Tzedek, and therefore he triggers this entire multi-pronged attack. It's an interesting thing just to note. Many times when people have tried to make peace with the modern state of Israel, the leaders have been killed. Anwar Sadat of Egypt is one example, and the grandfather of the present king, if you can call him that, of Jordan, was also shot to death in the doorway of the Al-Aqsa Mosque on the Temple Mount by an Arab activist who did not want Arab nations making any peace with the state of Israel. But let's go back 3,000 years, because that's where we are. So the king of Jerusalem, Adoni-Tzedek, calls four other kings. The kings of Hebron, as we know it today, Yarmuth, Lachish, and Eglon. And together they form a five-king coalition. And their first target is not Israel. It's the city of Gibeon. So they besiege that city. Now, in verses 6 through 11, Gibeon calls to Yoshua. They send word to Yehoshua. The Gibeonites send an urgent message to Yehoshua at Gilgal. I'm hoping that these names and these places are now becoming familiar to us, and that we're beginning to have a sense of where this all is on the map. They send the following message: Al reading glasses. Al teref yadecha mi avdecha, v'hoshia lano v'azrenu. Do not withdraw your hand from your servants. Meaning, despite the untoward beginnings and how we became part of your confederation and how we deceived you, do not withdraw your hand from us. Do not prevent yourself from protecting us. Please save us and help us. And that's in verse 6. Yehoshua responds. Hashem tells him, Al tira mehem, do not fear this confederation of five kings. Kibiyadcha netatim, do not fear them. This is verse 8. For I have given them into your hand. You know what is a surefire recipe for success? If Hashem wants it. If Hashem is on your side, you will not fail. Yoshua then marches the entire army through the night from Gilgal. He surprises this coalition at Gibeon. The enemy then flees westward towards the city of Beit Horon, Azekah, and Makedah. And then Hashem himself enters the battle. Huge stones fall upon the fleeing army. The text tells us that more of them die from the stones sent by Hashem than from Israel's swords. We get to verses 12 through 15, this miracle that everyone remembers from this chapter. Shemesh begivon dome. This is verse 12. It's like a command given to the sun. Sun, begivon dome. Stand still at Givon, B'yareach, and moon, Ba'emek Ayalon. Stand still in the valley of Ayalon. The day is extended until Israel can complete the victory. This whole thing, again, is reminiscent of all of the battles that have been fought, or most of the battles that have been fought, whether it be in Jericho or at the sea, or what happened in Egypt. And the text tells us something also very interesting, that this whole miraculous event is recorded in something called Sefer HaYashar, the book of the upright. What is this Sefer HaYashar? It's an outside source. The Tanakh is pointing to an outside source. We've seen that several times in the 5 books of Moses as well, in the Torah itself. For example, there's Sefer Milchamot Hashem, which is mentioned in Numbers. We'll come back to what Sefer HaYashar is, because it's an interesting story. We'll touch on that, but briefly. Then verses 16 through 27, we have the 5 kings. The 5 kings in this confederation flee, and they hide in a cave in the city of Makkedah. Yoshua then he finds out about this, and he has the cave sealed. Huge stones are placed in front of the mouth of the cave, but he does not stop the battle. First, he says to the armies, finish pursuing the enemy. And then the kings are brought out. Israel's commanders place their feet upon the necks of these 5 kings. Yehoshua tells them in verse 25, Al tir'u, v'al tichatu, do not fear and do not be dismayed. Chizku v'imtu, be strong and courageous. The kings are executed and hanged. But before nightfall, their bodies are taken down. That detail is going to matter. Verses 28 through 39, the southern cities fall one by one. The campaign moves rapidly southward. Makkedah, Livna, Lachish, Gezer, which I probably should have pointed out when we were looking at the map, is a city that actually comes to the aid of the Canaanite city Lachish, and they're defeated. And then there's Eglon, Hebron, and Devir. One city after another falls. And this is where the chapter becomes, I would say, difficult because of our modern sensibilities. But not just modern sensibilities. I mean, we have, fortunately, I think I'm sitting in the presence of people who have regard for the sanctity of human life. Isn't that something? Isn't that a good old-fashioned value? The text repeatedly uses the language of cherem, which means destruction, meaning to utterly cut off these populations. We're going to deal with that directly. And this is a question that Raphael asked the last time that we got together, so I wanted to make sure. And this chapter just presented, this is like the very next chapter, just presents itself as this wonderful opportunity to finally take a dive in. So then the camera pulls back, verses 40 through 43, and the chapter summarizes the campaign. V'et kol hamalachim ha'ela v'et artsam lachad Yoshua. Yoshua captured all these kings and their land in one campaign. Ki Hashem Elokei Yisrael nilcham liYisrael. How did that happen? Because Hashem, the God of Israel, fought for Israel. That's verse 42. That last sentence tells us how the chapter, so to speak, wants to be read. Ki Hashem Elokei Yisrael nilcham liYisrael. Hashem fought for Israel. So now we know what happens. The question is, what does it all mean? And strangely enough, in order to understand the book of Joshua, chapter 10 of the book of Joshua, we have to leave Joshua for a moment. We have to go back centuries. We have to go back to Abraham. We have to go back to a land that was already inhabited when he got there. When Hashem first speaks to Abraham, he says, Lech lecha mi'artzecha, go for yourself from your land, umimoladetecha, from your birthplace, umibeit avicha, from your father's house, el haaretz asher areka, to the land that I will show you. This is Genesis chapter 12, verse 1. Abraham goes, and he arrives in the land of Canaan. And then the Torah inserts 5 words that we could easily just sort of blow past. 5 words in English. Perhaps, I think it's actually 7 words in English. V'hakanani az ba'aretz. This is verse 6, chapter 12. The Canaanite was at that point in the land. Why tell us that? Because somebody is already here. God has not sent Abraham to an empty wilderness, to an empty lot. People live here. Cities exist here. There's already a civilization in that land. So the moral problem that we encounter in the book of Joshua is already present in the story of Abraham. If God intends this land for Abraham's descendants, what about the people who already live there? The question is so fundamental that Rashi, one of our main commentators on the Torah, places this question at the very beginning of the Torah. When I say at the beginning of the Torah, I mean this is Rashi's commentary on Genesis chapter 1, verse 1. Rashi asks why the Torah begins with the story of creation instead of beginning with the first mitzvah given to Israel. And this is a question, actually, he's bringing a question of Rabbi Yitzchak from the Talmud. Why begin the Torah with the story of creation? What is the Torah? Is the Torah a book of commandments, book of laws? If it's a book of laws, it should have begun with the first mitzvah that was given to the Jewish people as a distinct people, which was the mitzvah of Rosh Chodesh, which we are going to celebrate this week. Why does it begin with creation? So the answer that Rabbi Yitzchak gives, at least part of the answer, is this. If he says the nations are going to say, eventually the nations are going to say to Israel, Listim atem shechavashtem artzot shiva goyim. You are robbers. You conquered the lands of the 7 nations. It's an incredible thing to think that Rabbi Yitzchak, who was living in the 1st or 2nd century of the Common Era, is telling us that eventually the Jewish people are going to be accused of having stolen someone else's land. Does this sound familiar to you? It's like you could just click online and you will see the exact same accusation. What is Israel supposed to answer? Fortunately, he supplies the answer. He says, tell them, Kol haaretz shel HaKadosh Baruch Hu, the entire earth belongs to the Holy One, blessed be He. Hu bar'a, He created it, v'natnan la'asher yashar be'einav, and He gave it to whomever was proper and upright in His eyes. Birtzono natna lahem, by His will He gave it to them, meaning to say the original inhabitants. Ubirtzono natla mehem, and by His will He took it from them, v'natna lanu, and He gave it to us. Not exactly the kind of thing you can say from the, from the podium at the United Nations, right? But this is the answer. Now notice these words. Birtzono natna lahem. By His will He gave it to them. It's true. The people who once dwelled in the land of Canaan, in Canaan, were people that God gave that land to. Them. He gave it to them. That's important. Rashi doesn't describe the Canaanites as squatters just occupying land that never belonged to them. God gave them possession of it. So Israel cannot simply say, they can't just show up one day and say, Hashem promised us the land, get out. In fact, God Himself tells Abraham that his descendants cannot take the land yet. In Genesis chapter 15, verse 16, at what is known as the covenant between the pieces, Brit ben Abitarim, God says, Ki lo shalem avon ha'emori ad hena. For the iniquity of the Amorite is not yet complete. The Amorites are the Canaanite nations that are there. The reason why you can't have this land, that you can't fully take possession of this land, is because the iniquity of these people is not yet complete. Meaning to say that they have not filled their cups enough yet with sin. Think about that. The land has already been promised to Abraham's descendants. We see that much earlier. And yet God says, not yet. Why? Because the moral condition that will justify the removal of the Amorites, the Canaanites, has not yet been reached. The promise made to Abraham does not cancel justice for the Amorite, doesn't cancel their legal possession of the thing at that point. Abraham doesn't get to decide when they have finally forfeited their portion in the land. Isaac does not decide. Jacob does not decide. Israel as a whole doesn't get to decide. Hashem says, not yet. And Israel waits for generations. So when we finally reach the book of Joshua, we're not watching Israel suddenly decide that it wants somebody else's territory. Centuries have passed. We're reaching the end of a process that the Torah introduced centuries earlier. And that brings us back to our chapter 10 over here. Why is the king of Jerusalem afraid? The chapter begins, this is verse 1, Vayihi chishmo Adoni Tzedek melech Yerushalayim, and it was when Adoni Tzedek, the king of Jerusalem, heard Ki lachad Yoshu et ha'ai b'hechrima, that Joshua had captured the city of Ai and destroyed it. V'chi hishlimu yoshvei Gibeon et Yisrael v'yu b'kirbam, and that the inhabitants of Gibeon, the Gibeonites, had made peace with Israel and were among them. What frightens him? Obviously, the fall of Ai frightened him. I would imagine he'd heard about Jericho as well. But the text here immediately mentions something else. Gibeon, the Gibeonites, made peace. And Gibeon matters because Ki'ir Gedola Givon v'chol anashei Giborim, because it's a great city and all of its men are mighty. This is not a terrified little village. You saw how crafty they were. I mean, obviously they were afraid. And so they made this whole deception and bringing the moldy bread and wearing the worn out clothes, all that stuff. But this is a powerful place. Its men are warriors. And Gibeon has looked at what is happening and they made a choice. They left the Canaanite coalition. That may be more frightening to Adoni-Tzedek than the fall of Ai. Because a military defeat, that's one thing. But defection can spread. If the mighty Gibeon can make peace with Israel, who'll be next? So, Adoni-Tzedek sends to the kings of Hebron, that is Hebron, Yarmut, Lachish, and Eglon. He says in verse 4, Alu Eli, come up to me, v'azruni, and help me. V'nakeh et Gibeon, and let us strike Gibeon. Ki hishlima et Yehoshua et bnei Israel, because they have made peace with Joshua and the children of Israel. So who do they attack? They don't attack Israel. They attack Gibeon. 5 Canaanite kings are preparing to destroy a Canaanite city because that city chose peace. Remember that. It's going to become extremely important when we reach the question of the destruction of the Canaanites. Now, in the last chapter, when we met the Gibeonites, that was really an enemy that managed to make its way into a peace treaty with Israel by deception. It was yesterday's enemy. But now they issue a call for help. The Gibeonites send an urgent message to Yoshua, Al teref yodecha mi'avdecha. Do not withdraw your hand from your servants. They refer to themselves as his servants. Alei Elenu, come up to us quickly. Mehera. V'hoshia lanu ba'azreinu. Save us, help us. Verse 6. Now think about how strange this is. They lied. One chapter ago, these are the deceivers. They lied to Israel's leaders. Their deception was discovered. There was rage. There was anger. And now, almost immediately afterward, they call out, save us. And this is the perfect opportunity to let them finally get what's coming to them. Joshua could have hesitated, but instead we see in verse 7, Vayal Yoshua min ha-Gilgal. Joshua went up from Gilgal. Hu v'chol am ha-milchama imo. He and all the people of war with him, meaning to say the soldiers with him. V'chol giborei achayil, and all the mighty warriors that they had. And Hashem then says, Al tira mehem ki biyadcha natatim. Don't fear these kings. I've given them into your hand. Lo yamod ish mehem bifanecha. Not one of them will stand before you. That's in verse 8. This is what a covenant looks like when it becomes expensive. It's easy to keep a promise when the promise costs nothing. The Gibeonites deceived Israel, but Israel gave its word. And now, keeping that word means an all-night forced march and a major battle. And Joshua goes anyway. That's leadership. And it's integrity. A covenant matters most when you discover what keeping it is going to cost you. And then we have to look at the battle itself and ask the question, who is actually fighting here? Joshua attacks, but suddenly the text keeps directing our attention upward. Vayihumeim Hashem lifnei Israel. God threw them, the enemy, the five kings, their armies, into confusion before Israel. That's verse 10. The coalition flees. Israel pursues. And then, V'Hashem hishlich aleihem avanim gedolot min hashamayim. God cast great stones upon them from heaven, vayamutu, and they died. In verse 11. And then the text tells us something remarkable. Rabbi Mashemetu me avnei habarad. More of them died from the hailstones. Me asher hargu b'nei Yisrael becharev. Than those whom the children of Israel killed by the sword. Why tell us that? Because the chapter keeps asking us who is fighting this war. Israel's fighting. Joshua marched all night. The soldiers attacked. They pursued. Nobody stays in Gilgal and waits for a miracle while this Canaanite federation is approaching. Human effort is required. But we see that the decisive actor here is God. That heaven itself enters the battle. Now Yoshua says something completely out of the blue in terms of the commands that you would think would be issued during a siege, during a military campaign. Shemesh begivon dom. Sun, stand still at Givon. V'yareach, and moon, be'emek Ayalon. You stand in the valley of Ayalon, verse 12. And then Vayedom, Hashemesh. Vayareach amad ad yakom goy oyevav. The sun stood still, and the moon stopped, until the nation had taken vengeance upon its enemies. Verse 13. This text, this verse presents this as an extraordinary event. It's a miraculous event. And it continues, Vayamod Hashemesh bechatzi hashamayim. The sun stood in the middle of the heavens. Velo atz lavo kayom tamim. And did not hurry to set for approximately a full day. Just imagine that. How do you explain it? Well, whatever physical mechanism you propose, the point of what is being told to us is pretty unmistakable. The normal progress of the natural world, of the day itself, is interrupted in order for Israel to complete the battle. It would have been pretty exciting if just the sun had stopped in the middle of the sky. Why mention the moon? Because the verse gives us the whole sky. The sun is over Givon. The moon is over the valley of Ayalon. The normal heavenly cycle is not moving forward in its ordinary way. This isn't just like a nice poetic way of saying, you know how hard Israel fought? They fought so hard that the sun stood in the middle of the sky. No. The text wants us to experience the disruption of the natural order. This is not a natural, normal war. And then it adds, Halo hi ktuva al Sefer HaYashar. Is it not written in Sefer HaYashar? What is this Sefer HaYashar? What book is that? Well, there is actually a collection of what I think could be termed midrashim, similar to any of the other midrash, which is called Sefer HaYashar. And according to tradition or to legend, it was found in the home of someone who lived during the time of the first temple, this whole collection. Now, I actually have a copy of it right here. And there are a variety of different opinions as to whether this, in fact, is Sefer HaYashar, if, in fact, this is something that should be considered authoritative or not. And it's like half of the great scholars of Israel say yes, and half say no. But the stories themselves are phenomenal. Is it that specific book that is being mentioned in this verse? Not clear. The Tanakh is referring to a work known to its original audience, right? In other words, when Joshua writes this book, everybody knew what Sefer HaYashar was. No. And there's actually another reference to Sefer HaYashar in 2 Samuel chapter 1, verse 18, if you'd like to look that up. Now, Chazal and the classical commentator discuss the identity of this book. Some understand the expression is referring to one of the books of Torah that's associated with the Yesharim, meaning the upright. Who are the upright? Those are the Avot, the patriarchs of Israel. Other approaches understand it as a separate ancient work that's being cited by the biblical text. We don't have to solve the bibliographical mystery here. But the important point is that the narrator, right? The pasuk itself, the verse itself, appeals to a remembered record of an extraordinary event. I want to ask a different question. Why does this miracle happen here, not at Jericho, not at Ai, here? What started this battle? Gibeon made peace. The other Canaanite kings decided to destroy Gibeon for doing that. Israel comes to defend the covenant that it had made. And now heaven itself seems to enter the battlefield. First the stones, then the sun, then the moon. What these verses are telling us is that this is not merely a territorial dispute between ancient peoples. Something larger is taking place. The armies collapse, but the five kings escape. They hide in a cave at Makeda, and then they're discovered. And Joshua gives a very interesting order. Golu avanim gedolot, roll large stones, boulders, el pi ha'ma'ara, against the mouth of the cave, ve'afkidu aleh anashim l'shamram, and station men beside it to guard them. This is in verse 18. Here's a question. Why not deal with the kings immediately? These are the perpetrators. These are the culprits. And the answer is because the battle is not finished. And Joshua says, Ve'atem al tamodu. He turns to the rest of the army and he says, don't stop. Ridfu achrei oivechem. Pursue your enemies, verse 19. A very powerful leadership lesson here. Don't confuse the symbol of victory with the objective. I mean, it would have been a very big trophy to have these five kings because they were the ones who initiated this battle in the first place. Capturing those five kings feels like victory. It's dramatic. But the enemy army is still out there in the field. So finish the job. Only afterward does Joshua return to the kings. He brings them out And then he tells Israel's military commanders, Kirvu, come forward. Simu et raglechem al tzavarei hamalachim ha'ela. Place your feet upon the necks of these kings. Verse 24. You can already hear the Human Rights Council of the UN like just cucking away. Right? To modern ears, it's very uncomfortable. It sounds like humiliation. But listen to Joshua's explanation of this action. Al tir'u, do not fear, v'al tichatu, and do not be dismayed, do not be frightened. Chizku v'imtzu, be strong and courageous. Ki kacha ya'aseh Hashem l'chol oivechem asher atem nilchamim otam. Because thus will God do to all of your enemies against whom you fight. Verse 25. Listen to those words. Chizku ve'imtzu, be strong and courageous. Does it sound familiar? Where have we heard that before? All the way at the beginning of the book of Joshua. God repeatedly told Joshua, Chazak v'yematz, be strong and courageous. Now Joshua turns to the next generation of commanders and tells them, Chizku v'imtzu. God gave courage to Joshua, and now Joshua gives courage to the others. And that's how leadership reproduces itself. Moving on. What do you do with the bodies of your enemies? These 5 kings are executed. Their bodies are hanged upon trees. But then we read, Vayehi la'ed bo hashemesh, and at the time of sunset, Tziva Yehoshua, Joshua issued the command, V'yoridu mi'al ha'etzim, and they took them down from the trees. In verse 27. Now, why does the text tell us this? Because actually Joshua is carrying out a command that we find in the Torah. In Deuteronomy chapter 21, verse 23, regarding somebody who was an idol worshiper who was then condemned to death by the court and executed, his body is supposed to be hung in plain sight for others to see. It's a method of deterrence. And it's a way of saying, look what happens to people who commit these acts. But then there's a commandment there. Lo talin nivlato al ha'etz. His corpse shall not remain overnight upon the tree. Ki kilalat elokim talui. For a hanging body is a degradation of God. It's remarkable, that last phrase. What does it mean that the hanging body of a criminal is a kilalat elokim? Is a degradation or a desecration of God. So Rashi brings the teaching of Chazal, and he says the following thing. Human beings are created in the image of God. Tselem Elokim, we learned that all the way back in Genesis. Imagine, Rashi says, twin brothers who look exactly alike, identical twins. One of them becomes king, and the other becomes a criminal and is hanged. People would pass by, see the body, and they would say the king is hanging. And this would be a disgrace for the king. Now, the point is not that the criminal is innocent. He's been judged. He's been executed. And And he's been hanged in full view. And yet even his dead body bears the imprint of the divine image, Tselem Elokim. And therefore there's a limit to how long this body could be publicly degraded. And that's extraordinary in this chapter. These kings fought Israel. They attacked Gibeon. They have just been executed and still take the bodies down. I want you to think about this, friends. The Torah does not say that once someone becomes your enemy, anything may be done to him. War doesn't suspend Torah. Victory doesn't suspend Torah. Punishment is one thing. Humiliation for the sake of humiliation is another. And that distinction is hardly ancient history. All right, this is a region where I'm talking to you from, where in the modern period as well, the bodies of enemies have sometimes been dragged through streets, mutilated, displayed, or turned into public trophies. I don't know if you looked at all of those pictures that ISIS terrorists, published of heads on pikes and all sorts of awful, horrifying images. Or if you happen to see what happened to the soldiers that unfortunately ended up in Ramallah about 15 years ago, and their bodies were torn apart and passed around. Excuse me. The Torah teaches us something different. The enemy may have to be fought. A guilty person may have to be punished. But the human body is not a toy. It's not a trophy. Justice cannot turn into intoxication with the humiliation of other people. And now we reach the hardest part of this chapter. He left none remaining. Makkedah falls, then Livna, then Lachish. Horam, king of Gezer, comes to help Lachish, and he's defeated. And then Eglon, Hebron, Devir. Again and again and again, the language becomes very severe. At Makkedah, we read, V'et Malka Hechreim Otam, Kol HaNefesh, Asher Ba, Lo Hishir Sarid. He destroyed its king and every soul within it. He left no survivor. Verse 28. Now we can't just read that and move on. That was annihilation. A modern listener is going to ask, what are we reading here? Is this genocide? Now, the wrong response would be to become nervous and pretend the Torah says something softer than it does. It doesn't. The Torah says something concerning the 7 Canaanite nations. Back in Deuteronomy chapter 7, verse 2. Hachreim tachrim otam. You shall utterly destroy them. Not soft language. And also in chapter 20, verse 16 of Deuteronomy, it says, Lo sichayeh kol neshama. You shall not allow any soul to live. The Rambam counts the destruction of the 7 nations as a positive commandment for all generations, where that is possible. We have to own this text. But owning the text means reading all of it. And the rest of the Torah changes the picture considerably. Why were the Canaanites being removed? Why did this have to be the fate of the 7 Canaanite nations? We already saw God tell Abraham, Ki lo shalem avon ha'amori adhena, that the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet complete. That tells us that there is a moral process taking place here. But in Leviticus, the point is made very, very explicit. After listing forbidden sexual practices and the worship of Molech, which is an idol that was worshipped in those days, the Torah tells the Jewish people, Al titamu b'chol eila. Do not defile yourselves through any of these things, any of these behaviors. Ki b'chol eila nitmeu hagoyim asher ani mishalech mipnechem. For through all these things, the nations that I am sending away from before you became defiled. That's what they did. That's in Leviticus chapter 18, verse 24. And then it says, V'titma ha'aretz v'efkod avona aleha v'takia aretz et yoshveha. Chapter 18, verse 25. In Leviticus, it says, the land became defiled. I visited its iniquity upon it, meaning to say, I punished that land. I punished the people in that land. And the land vomited out its inhabitants, or will vomit out its inhabitants. That's the Torah's own explanation as to why this is the fate of the Canaanites. Meaning that these nations are not removed from this land simply because they are Canaanites. This is not an ethnic issue. The Torah describes in very stark detail a society that has become morally corrupted. But here comes the crucial part. God immediately turns to Israel and says, do not do these things yourselves. Why? Meaning to say, when we say do not do these things yourselves, means do not imitate the practices of these people. Why not? V'lo takia aretz etchem b'tamachem ota, so that the land will not vomit you out when you defile it, or if you defile it. Kasher ka'aet hagoy asher lifnechem, as it vomited out the nation that was before you. That's Leviticus chapter 18, verse 28. That changes everything. The Torah does not say they're Canaanites, you're Israelites, therefore you deserve the land and they don't. It doesn't say that. It says they corrupted the land. There's something that you have to understand about Eretz Israel. Eretz Israel is Eretz HaKodesh. That is the Holy Land. It has its own spiritual physics, and you cannot violate them. And it doesn't matter which nation does that. If they do it, the land will vomit them out. Very, very clear black on white language. It says they corrupted this land, and eventually the land expelled them. And if you do the same thing, it will expel you too. There's no racial immunity here. There's no ethnic blank check. This land belongs to God. The Canaanites live upon it under his authority. Israel will live upon it under his authority. And both are morally accountable. And that brings us back to that first Rashi that we mentioned. Kol ha'aretz shel HaKadosh Baruch Hu hi. The whole earth belongs to God. That principle is a universal principle. It cannot work only in Israel's favor. If Hashem owns the land before Israel enters that land, he still owns the land after Israel enters the land. And you know what? Later Jewish history will prove exactly that Israel itself can be exiled. Now, we can still ask the question, was destruction the only option? There's a lot of ways to get a population out of a territory. You can send blimps, hot air balloons, and moving trucks, whatever, some other way. Give them bicycles. But now we come to something essential. The same Rambam who codifies the command to destroy the seven nations also tells us what must happen before war. In Hilchot Melachim, chapter 6, he says the following: Ein osin milchama im adam ba'olam. We do not wage war against anyone in this world. Ad shekorin lo shalom. Until we first call to him for peace. Echad milchemet hareshut, whether that be what is known as a milchemet hareshut, it doesn't really mean an optional war. It means a war that may be strategically important, but you still have to ask the Kohen Gadol, who has to essentially present that question to Hashem before Israel can embark upon a war like that. V'echad milchemet mitzvah, or for a commanded war. There are commanded wars in the Torah. There are two of them. One of them is against the seven Canaanite nations, and the other one is against Amalek. And if they accept peace, and they accept the seven Noahide laws, the Rambam says, Ein horgin mehen neshama. We do not kill a single soul among them. That's essential. Because the seven nations are the very nations that are subject to the command of Cherem, being destroyed. And yet there's a path by which they live. They don't have to become Jews. They don't have to join Israel. They accept the universal moral order required of humanity, the seven Noahide laws, and Israel's political authority in that territory, and they live. Rambam explicitly applies this principle to the seven nations, and he cites Joshua chapter 11, where it says, Lo haita ir asher hishlima et bnei Yisrael bilti hachivi yoshvei Givon. There was no city that ultimately made peace with the children of Israel except the Hivites or the inhabitants of Givon. That's chapter 11, verse 19. Rambam's point is that peace was available. And he preserves an extraordinary tradition. Before Israel entered the land, Joshua sent three messages. Misha rotzeh livroach yivrach. Whoever wishes to flee, flee. The fact is that the command to destroy the Canaanites only exists within that territory. If you meet a Canaanite in Kalamazoo or in Paris, there is absolutely no commandment to touch that person whatsoever. So whoever wishes to flee, flee. You want to get out? Get out. Mishirotzi lashlim, yashlim. Whoever wishes to make peace, make peace. Mishirotzi la'asot milchama, yaseh. Whoever wishes to make war, make war. There's three doors that Joshua gave them. Leave, make peace, fight. Only one of them necessarily leads to the battlefield. That means that it's not accurate to describe the Torah's command as find everybody belonging to a particular ethnicity and kill them because of their ethnicity. Our sources do not allow that reading. And suddenly we understand why chapters 9 and 10 spend so much time talking about Gibeon. Gibeon is the key to understanding this whole thing. Gibeon is not a side story between the Battle of Ai and the conquest of the south. Gibeon is the key to understanding the conquest of the south. Who are these people? Who are the Gibeonites? They're Canaanites. What happens to them? They survive. More than that, when other Canaanites try to kill them because they made peace with Israel, what does Israel do? Joshua marches all night to save them. And what does Hashem do? Hashem throws their attackers into confusion. He casts stones on them from heaven. The sun itself remains in the sky while Israel completes the battle. If the war was simply about exterminating an ethnic group called Canaanites, chapter 10 wouldn't make any sense. And we see Israel's risking its own soldiers to save Canaanites. So the dividing line has to be somewhere else. And the Rambam gives us another piece in Sefer HaMitzvot, which is sort of the introduction to the Mishnah Torah. When he explains the prohibition, there's a negative command, lo techayeh kol neshama. You're not allowed to let any combatant in the land of Canaan live. He says that its purpose is kadesha lo. Well, it's not any combatant. It's really once they've made the decision to make war, then it's complete scorched earth at that point. Then nobody lives. He explains that prohibition. He says the purpose is kadesha lo yidyachdu bam b'nei adam v'situm la'avodah zarah, so that people shouldn't join themselves to any of those remaining people and be led by them into idolatry. We have to state this very carefully. This command is directed against specifically the 7 Canaanite nations. But the Rambam tells us that its rationale is not a doctrine of racial purity. It's not about their ethnicity as Canaanites, as the Aegean peoples who came to that land. The concern is that the idolatrous culture of Canaan should not remain intact and draw Israel into its practices. And where peace is accepted on the terms that the Torah requires, the person lives. What are the terms that the Torah requires? They have to accept the Sheva Mitzvot. What is the most important one of those Sheva Mitzvot? Maybe I'm being silly by saying that, but come on, if you think about like what's the biggest ticket item, if not a complete and utter prohibition on all idol worship? If they accept those terms and to live by them, they don't represent the population of people that are going to influence other people to do the wrong things. So it doesn't make the violence emotionally easy to see. It's not supposed to. But what it does do is it tells us what category the Torah itself places this war into. It's not a racial conquest. It's divine judgment upon a particular civilization at a particular point in history under a specific command from Hashem. And that distinction is essential. Now, I mean, when we say a particular point in history, what we're talking about here is the entire period that spans from the conquest under Joshua to the time of King David, when essentially this population was let's say electorally marginal. And then we have the invasion of the Assyrians in the year 722 BCE, and the emperor of Assyria was Sanherib. We have what the Gemara tells us is Sanherib bilbel et ha'umot, meaning to say that what the Assyrians did was what many ancient empires did when they conquered a territory, which is to say that they took its inhabitants and they put them somewhere else in the territory of the empire. And why did they do that? In order to break the emotional connection to any particular territory. This way they would stifle rebellion. In other words, if an army comes in, they conquer the territory, they take the people there and they put them 1,000 miles away, 3,000 kilometers away, The next generation is not really going to be thinking about the original location. Okay, so the 10 tribes that we did lose were carted away during that first invasion. Those are referred to as the 10 lost tribes. We'll see them again at the during the time of Geula, hopefully. But those people may not themselves understand that they are B'nai Israel at this point. In other words, judgment is not about ethnicity. The whole structure now comes together. God sends Abraham to a land that is already inhabited, as we saw about Canaanite, Ba'aretz. The Canaanites are there. This land is promised to Abraham, but Israel can't take it yet. Ki lo shilem avon ha'amori aleina, because their sin has not reached like the spilling over level yet. Not yet. Centuries pass. Eventually, the moral account reaches a different point. But even then, according to the halachic tradition that we're seeing here from the Rambam, there's alternatives. Leave, make peace, or fight. And Givon demonstrates that the alternative is real. It's a real alternative. We're not just playing, tricks here. And that's also why we have to be very careful about taking this chapter and turning it into a general theory of religious warfare. This is not jihad. Joshua does not wake up one morning and decide, these people are evil. God must want me to kill them. We've got enough of that going on in the world today, do we not? That's not what this is. He has specific divine commandments concerning identifiable peoples at a specific moment in biblical history. Once we reach the point when Sancherib comes to the land of Israel and takes away, but Sancherib did this to the entire Near East region, and he's bilbel et ha'umot, meaning to say he confused them. You would have no way of identifying any of the original inhabitants of any of the lands that were conquered by Assyria. So there's no positively identifiable people anymore. There are no positively identifiable Canaanites anymore. And the Rambam concludes, Ukavar avad zichra, meaning their identity has already been lost. So the command is not a free-floating license for later generations to identify some disliked nation and call them Canaanites and declare a holy war against them. Okay? That's not what the halacha says. Institutions can normalize evil. Societies can become corrupt. Cultures can teach people to regard things that are wicked as ordinary. Hello, this is the world that we live in today. And no civilization becomes morally innocent because its practices have existed for a long time. So what's the Noahide message here? For B'nai Noach, there's something very powerful. What's the road out of the Canaanite order, according to the Rambam? It's the acceptance of the 7 mitzvot B'nai Noach. The alternative is not become Jewish. I mean, you want to become Jewish? Come on in. This is a price of admission. But to be makabel, to receive, to accept upon oneself those Sheva mitzvot, that's to become part of the moral order that Hashem established for humanity. Reject idolatry, reject murder, reject forbidden sexual relationships, reject theft, reject blasphemy, reject cruelty, represented by eating flesh taken from a living animal. Establish courts of justice. That tells us something fundamental about the Sheva Mitzvot, the 7 laws. That they're not only rules, like private rules for private behaviors. Together, these laws form the minimum moral architecture of human civilization. The Sheva Mitzvot say that human civilization is accountable before God. And perhaps that's one of the deepest universal lessons of Joshua chapter 10. Modern people tend to think about morality almost entirely in individual terms. Was this individual good? Was that individual wicked? But Tanakh also thinks about nations, about cultures, about institutions, about civilizations. A society can create habits. A society can reward particular behaviors and reinforce them. And they can normalize things that previous generations would have recognized immediately, right off the bat, as evil. And eventually, a civilization can acquire a moral character of its own. That doesn't mean that we're entitled to look around the modern world and announce that Hashem is about to destroy whichever society we dislike. We don't have Joshua's prophecy. Like, we don't possess those prophetic abilities. And we don't have that direct command. But we can learn this principle. No civilization owns tomorrow. Power today is not permanence. Success is not innocence. And God's patience is not the same thing as God's approval. Now, look back at the beginning of this chapter. 5 kings seem very powerful. Gibeon seems vulnerable. Israel has to march through the night, which places them at risk. But by the end of the chapter, where are those 5 kings? They're buried in a cave. Their armies have collapsed, their cities have fallen, and who's still alive? The people they intended to punish for making peace. Gibeon. That is the great reversal of this chapter. The old Canaanite coalition tries to destroy the Gibeonites, the Canaanites who've broken away from that coalition. But the coalition itself collapses. And then we read, Vayakem Yoshua mikadesh Barnea vi'ad Aza vi'et kol eretz Goshen vi'ad Givon. In verse 41, it says, Joshua struck them from Kadesh Barnea to Gaza and all of the land of Goshen as far as Givon. And then the next verse, which explains the chapter, Viet kol hamalachim ha'ela, and all these kings, Viet artsam lachad Yoshua pam achat. Joshua captured all these kings and their land in one campaign because Ki Hashem Elokei Yisrael nilcham liYisrael, because Hashem, the God of Israel, fought for Israel. There's the answer. Ki Hashem Elokei Yisrael nilcham liYisrael. This was never merely Joshua's war. We began with a question. What are we watching in Joshua chapter 10? Conquest? Yes. A military campaign? Certainly. A frightening episode of ancient warfare? Without question. But Tanakh asks us to see something larger. The story begins centuries earlier. God sends Abraham into an inhabited land. The Canaanites are already there. The land is promised, but it cannot be taken because they haven't reached their absolute bottom of the barrel yet. Not yet. God waits, generations pass, and that's worth thinking about. Divine judgment doesn't come immediately, and human beings then make a mistake. We begin to think that it'll never come. We confuse patience with indifference. We have to know that Hashem is not indifferent to anything that goes on in this world. And the Torah tells Abraham that history can contain very long moral accounts. Right? God tells Abraham that your descendants are going to serve Egypt for 400 years. Can you wrap your head around 400 years? It ended up being only 210. We can get into that some other time. And centuries later, the moment changes. Even then, according to the tradition that we see in the Rambam, there's alternatives. Leave, make peace, or fight. Gibeon chooses peace, and they survive. And not only that, it more than survives. Israel risks its soldiers to protect them. The kings, on the other hand, they choose war, and they choose war specifically against the Canaanites who choose peace. And then the chapter erupts. We see the whole thing. And then when the kings are hanged, the Torah tells them take the bodies down before nightfall. Why? Because even the body of an executed enemy bears the dignity of a human being created in the image of God. That principle is there even amidst this whole brutal scenario. Maybe one of the most important details in the chapter. Power doesn't cancel out morality. War doesn't cancel Torah. And the same Torah that explains why the Canaanites lose the land turns immediately to Israel and says, do not become like them. Otherwise, the land will vomit you out too. And that's why Rashi's words at the beginning of Genesis are so important. Because the entire earth belongs to God. Not to Canaan, absolutely. Not even to Israel, absolutely. To God. We possess land. We build cities and establish governments and create civilizations. But we don't become the absolute owners of God's world. We remain accountable for everything we do when we build upon it. And for my friends, the B'nai Noach, that's the enduring message of this chapter. The Sheva Mitzvot teach that Hashem does not care only about what happens inside a synagogue. He cares about human civilization. He cares whether there's real justice, whether life is treated as sacred, whether property is respected, whether sexuality has boundaries. He cares whether human beings recognize that there is a creator above them. And he cares what kind of society those beliefs produce. We have big ticket items like the sun standing still. It's a spectacular miracle, but probably the deepest idea in this chapter is quieter. History is not morally neutral. The kings gather. This essentially is the coming due of the long account that begins in the days of Abraham. Gibeon calls for help. Joshua marches. The stones fall. The sun stands still. And for one extraordinary day in the history of the Tanakh, heaven goes to war.